year from the Prime Minister of Sweden. Tom Donahue is, as we all know, the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO. He is the 8th person, though Tommy and I may argue a bit about the history of this, to hold the office. For a while in the history of the Federation, the office was solely that of Secretary with a separate treasurer. And starting in 1936, as I recall, the two offices were combined. And so he has been the 8th person to hold this office in our labor movement over the last 100 years or so. And I think it should be noted that he is a person who brings to this job a long and diversified career in our labor movement, because he worked with the Service Workers Union out of New York, and then as assistant to that president of that international union, and then as an assistant to Mr. George Meany, and then succeeded to this post of Secretary-Treasurer when Mr. Kirkland became president. I also think it important in these brief remarks to point out in a school of government that Tom was for several years an assistant secretary of labor, and has therefore brings to this present job a public service career with the perspective that has given him over the years. Served on foundation boards, and therefore I think in terms of the breadth of his experience, in my view, brings to this important post a real unusual range of interests and accomplishments as compared to those who have been his predecessor. There is, however, one other feature or so of his career that I think I'm required to say a word about in a university audience, that he has chosen to address himself on occasions to important intellectual questions. If you have not done so, you ought to read the trade union perspective on the last encyclical issued in 1981 dealing with labor matters. And he raises some very interesting questions there for all of us about the concept that a labor movement is not only necessary but absolutely indispensable to a Western and democratic society. He develops the notion of when it ought to be adversarial and when it ought to be cooperative, some of the issues that underlie a great deal of the philosophy of current public and labor management debate. More recently, of course, he chaired the committee of the Federation of the Executive Council, anyway, of the Federation, that prepared a report which was issued in February entitled The Changing Situation of Workers and Their Unions in the United States. I can think of no document in the history of our labor movement which as candidly and as frankly explored the problems that confront the American labor movement and their future, and yet with such imagination about prospects of activities for the future. And I'm sure that it is to that theme that he will lead us tonight. Now, Before I turn the podium over to Mr. Donahue, I want to be sure to recognize in this auditorium Mrs. Mildred Worf, who is sitting here in the front row, President Jerry McEntee of the AFSCME Union, and I'm particularly happy again to have present Rochelle Horowitz Donahue, who I see only when I am introducing Tommy, it seems. So will you welcome with me Mr. Donahue for our second lecture tonight.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dunlop and I take turns introducing one another and trying to be kind to one another as best we can. I'm delighted, John, to join you, to join Hale Champion, and be with you here at the Kennedy School. I am most pleased to be with you in the company of Mildred Worf and Nicholas Worf, who are the people who most intimately shared Jerry Worf's life, and to be with Jerry McEntee, his successor in office, who most intimately shares his headaches and the problems of his union, but also shares Jerry Worf's drive, determination, dedication, and who leads AFSCME with great distinction. I am honored to have been asked to deliver the 1985 Jerry Worf Memorial Lecture, to attempt therein to reflect the ideals and the dedication of a man who contributed greatly to the growth and the present strength of that movement, and who more than any other individual was responsible for the development of public sector trade unionism in America. The institution that Jerry Worf built and strengthened as a tool for advancing the interests of public employees, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, will continue to reflect his contribution to society and to carry forward the work he advanced. That institution, now more than 1 million members strong, is a vibrant element of America's unions today because he did so very much to imbue it with a spirit and a philosophy grounded in strength, militancy, and self-sufficiency. Jerry Worf was an intellectual, though he rejected the label, whose intellectualism was tempered by a very large helping of street smarts. He was an idealist whose idealism cohabited very comfortably with his pragmatism, and he was a militant who never let it get in the way of a proper agreement. In sum, he was, like all great trade unionists, a man of many parts, all kept in balance by a keen understanding of workers and their interests. America's unions today are the product of that same mix of militancy and agreement, of idealism and pragmatism, of intellectualism and street smarts that Jerry Worf so fully embodied. They are driven by an intellectual understanding of the essentiality in a democratic society of an organizational or institutional approach which, while fully respectful of the rights of individuals, combines those individuals and their strengths into a representative democracy. They struggle to achieve full participation in such a structure while resisting the blandishments of a participatory democracy which their street smarts tell them is elitist. They are also intellectually idealistic about their aims and goals, and street smarts pragmatic about how to achieve them. They're militant, but never without purpose, and always seeking agreement and progress. America's unions today constitute a vital, powerful, and effective movement working for the gradual progression toward a society in which more equal social power will be held by the workers and by the people than is held by the government and by corporations, with a resultant improvement in the lives of all. It is a movement with faith in the nation and with faith in its own ability to make that nation more responsive to the needs of workers and to the needs of all the people. It is a movement which seeks to serve the United States and to improve the United States. It seeks the more rational distribution of our national wealth, the renewal of our institutions, and the larger participation of all at all levels. And it seeks to assist workers in other lands who pursue those same goals. The foundation stone of our unions is their primary focus on the representation of their members vis-à-vis the employer. They seek to improve the lives of those they represent by improving their conditions of work and by ensuring respect for the dignity of workers. They believe that each worker is entitled to a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. That pay should include a share in the profit the worker helps to create, and so unions seek a larger share of those profits than market forces might dictate. While recognizing that profits are essential, they know well that a well-managed enterprise requires that both capital and labor contribute significantly to the result. Since its earliest days, this labor movement has sought to improve the quality of work life, create workplace democracy, and participate in joint employer-employee decision-making long before those approaches became fashionable. In their secondary role, our trade unions have sought to improve the conditions of life of their members by improving the conditions of life for all in our democratic society through political action and legislative efforts. In sum, they seek, through collective bargaining, political participation, and legislative activity, to bring about a broader sharing in the riches of the nation. America's unions today are the net product of over 150 years of development, of successes and failures, and they reflect the fact that for all of those years they've existed in struggle. They've never been welcomed by employers or well received by the community. But then again, they are disturbers of the status quo, change agents in society, and such people never are well accepted or well received. The pages of labor history are filled with the sacrifice and in some cases the blood of American workers. And those struggles and sacrifices continue today in southern mill towns, in western mining communities, in major cities, in country towns all across the nation where hospital and healthcare workers struggle for recognition, and they continue wherever pickets walk. Today's unions are the inheritors of all of that history, the bearers of all of those scars. I suppose it's because of our pride in having overcome those substantial adversities that we tend to expect present participants to be inordinately grateful for what they have inherited, in somewhat the manner of the now comfortable family head lecturing his offspring about how hard life was in what the offspring can only vaguely refer to as the olden days. That past holds great value for the lessons it can teach, but it ought never be the vehicle by which anybody glides over our current failures or inadequacies, nor can we ever allow it to be a substitute for meeting the problems of this day. No activist or leader of this labor movement can merely preside over what was created in the past or use its past glories or accomplishments to justify tolerating the status quo. In a world which changes as rapidly as ours, activists and leaders must learn from the past, but continually must focus their attention on today and tomorrow. Out of that necessity to focus on today and tomorrow, the AFL-CIO Executive Council created its Committee on the Evolution of Work and its Implications. That committee issued its first report in August of 1983 entitled The Future of Work, analyzing the changes that have occurred and are occurring in the workplace and in the workforce, and attempted to draw the nation's attention to the continuing shortfall of employment opportunity. Its second report, The Changing Situation of Workers and Their Unions, was issued in February of 1985 and has formed the basis for much of the future-oriented discussion within the labor movement this year. That report focuses on today and tomorrow and examines the questions raised in terms of what is doable now by our unions rather than by any external forces, thereby forcing any in our ranks who might like to wish away our problems or explain away our weaknesses or revel in past glories to abandon those comfortable non-pursuits, and forces them instead to grapple with the problems of today and the opportunities of tomorrow. The question for us is not when the nation will come to its senses and amend the labor law, not when the other half of our states will get around to passing adequate public employee collective bargaining laws, not when short-sighted or mean-spirited employers will mend their ways, but rather what we can do to remedy the utter and abject failure of the National Labor Relations Act, the absence of public employee labor laws, what we can do to improve the vision and soul of the nation's employers, and what we can do to improve our own ability to recruit and to activate members. The central reality of today and tomorrow is that a democratic nation cannot long endure without the industrial democracy that results from a vibrant democratic trade union movement. So the issue is not whether the nation wishes to see American trade unions survive in good health, but whether our democracy can survive if they do not. I obviously believe that it cannot, a view that ought to be shared by everyone who has ever reflected upon human nature or upon the real meaning of concupiscence. While the essence of trade union activity remains today as valid as ever, the manifestations of that activity have been alarmingly reduced. Trade union membership is down, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of the workforce. Real wages of all workers have been declining for the past 13 years, and trade union activity has not shifted importantly to the growing employment sectors. On the other hand, there is no evidence that trade unionism is not serving its members well, no evidence that it has suffered any real loss of membership because of the disaffection of current members. In fact, the evidence is all to the contrary. Decertifications of unions by their members, while numerically higher than in prior years, remain statistically insignificant at less than 0.1% of current membership. And more than 75% of trade unionists reported themselves as extremely well satisfied or reasonably well satisfied with their union and their union services in a recent poll conducted by Lou Harris and Associates. A report issued last January by the Bureau of Labor Statistics analyzing wages and benefits in the United States noted that trade union members averaged 33% more than their non-union counterparts. So the value of organization in wage and benefit terms remains as great today as ever. The report on the changing situation of workers and their unions offered a series of recommendations for the consideration of our affiliates with respect to new methods of advancing the interests of workers, ways of increasing members' participation in their unions, and of improving labor's communications both internally and externally. Further recommendations dealt with improving our union organizing activity and with structural changes to enhance the labor movement's overall effectiveness. In the 8 months since its issuance, that report has formed the basis for self-analysis, for discussion and planning by the Federation, by our affiliated unions, by state federations and central labor councils. A number of national unions have established special committees to analyze the report and to discuss how its ideas might best be applied. The committee continues to function as a working group, reviewing the implementation of several of its recommendations, such as the development of television performance workshops for union leaders, the creation of a pilot program to increase the level of membership participation entitled One-on-One, the establishment of a membership benefit program consisting of various forms of consumer and insurance programs, and other services to be made available to affiliated unions, their members, and to union associates, and the launching of a coordinated organizing campaign in the healthcare insurance industry. The report has even occasioned interest abroad. It was reported on at length in the publications of the International Federation of Free Trade Unions, and most recently was reprinted in Japanese by the Japanese Federation of Commercial Workers and the Japan Labor Institute. In this country, the report has been much commented on, favorably for the most part, although it should be noted that some of those commentators have been gleeful about finding among our admissions of inadequacy an echo of some criticism that they themselves have offered in the past, and they're now prepared to concede that we're brilliant for agreeing with them. America's unions tomorrow will surely be affected by that report and by the suggestions for change and the new programs which will arise from the consideration and discussion that that report has engendered. The American Union tomorrow will be far more technically competent. Its leaders, conditioned hopefully to see the past only as a learning device, will focus on the present and the future which confronts them. Its spokespersons, now being trained in performance workshops, will be more open and accessible to the media and will hopefully explain our actions and our goals better. Its activists, now being trained in one-on-one communication skills, will force discussion and review of union and union-related issues among a better informed and therefore more involved membership. Its specialists, skills honed in the universities and in the shops, will deal with the myriad complexities of pension administration, stock ownership and stock options, workplace democracy, buyouts and takeovers, worker ownership, international competition, corporate campaigns, affirmative action, career ladders, safety and health issues, attrition agreements, coalitions, political action, and 1,000 other involvements. Its organizers' car trunks will be filled not just with leaflets and picket signs, but hopefully with video cassettes and corporate analysis data. Its members, better informed and more involved, will enliven the internal political life of their unions, strengthen the indicia of trade union democracy, and continue to insist on a primary focus on job-related conditions. Those members will maintain positions ranging from tolerance to understanding to support for the secondary activities of their unions, while the general public will judge union activities on an inverse scale, caring least about the primary activities and most about the impact of the secondary activities in the community, legislative, and political role. Interestingly, it's because of that inversion that the general public ought to be most concerned about the future of our unions. Almost without regard to the percentage of the workforce represented, though there are obviously some limits, unions will always continue to carry out their primary role, representation of worker interests on the jobs. In that role, even at a 1% level of organization, the union would remain the most significant force in the work life of its members, with some obvious limitations on its market power admitted. But if our unions continue to shrink as a percentage of the workforce or in absolute numbers, their ability to influence political, legislative, and community developments will be limited to the detriment of the nation. It's interesting to note the comment of the nationally syndicated columnist David Broda on this point. In a piece which he wrote entitled "Dawning of a New Day for Labor," commenting on the report, Broda said, "The report has significance for anyone interested in the future of American politics. For anyone my age, at least, it is impossible to imagine a strong current of liberal politics in this country without a strong labor movement. America's unions tomorrow, I'm confident, will not disappoint Mr. Broda and will be fully involved in that strong current of liberal politics. while some voices outside our ranks have cavilled with our primary endorsements and our involvement in party politics, there is near unanimous support for that conduct from within, and we will persist as a federation in our attempts to maintain unity in our ranks and to be a united trade union force in American politics at city, state, and national levels, because so much of the lives of our members is affected by those processes. The presence or absence of an endorsement will not matter so much as the process, which is important to us as the solidarity it represents. America's unions tomorrow, in the near tomorrows, will reverse the concessionary agreements of some industries and some public employment, but may well extend them in others. They will continue to experiment with various types of employee stock or ownership plans, with the knowledge, reinforced over time, that they have been invited in on all the losers, while shared ownership seems undreamed of in the prosperous enterprises. In the longer term, if someone has by then rationalized economic theory in such a way as to make the acceptance of risk and the possibility of commensurate gain a part of employee compensation systems, America's unions tomorrow may even get to negotiate such shared ownership agreements with some prosperous employers. Somehow, that elementary and long-standing economic thought that since workers don't share in the rewards, they shouldn't be asked to share the risks, seems to be set aside only when the risk increases precipitously and the phrase risk capital suddenly loses its modifier. I have long believed that stock ownership plans where stocks provided as a part of compensation over and above a basic living, saving family wage may well represent the best way of accommodating the reality that workers can't share in risk at the level of their basic compensation, but that when they share negotiated profit distribution on the high end, that may well represent not only a more appropriate distribution of profits, but an incentive to productivity as well. Those kinds of negotiated distributions will be a long way removed from the illusory promises of ESOPs, or ASOPs as they might more appropriately be titled. They would also differ substantially from the suggestions of a share economy in which we begin by slashing workers' wages, reducing their purchasing power, and in fact testing the theory of whether a hungry dog hunts better. It's fascinating to me that when we speak of fair trade, it's labeled protectionism, and the specter of Smoot-Hawley is resurrected by the President of the United States. But when people speak of rolling back wages and repeating the economics of the Great Depression, that gets examined as a new idea. All of the old wage theories will need to be revisited in the light of the increasing prevalence of the two-wage earner family. For many decades, our basic wage theory was grounded on the premise that the worker was entitled to a larger share of the wealth he or she helps to create, which we translated at the bargaining table as a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. But since that again needed translation, we relied much more heavily on arguments for a living, saving family wage, a wage sufficient to allow a worker to provide decently for his or her family. Those translations had equal applicability at public sector bargaining tables, where they were sometimes further translated into wage and fringe comparability. We haven't yet put that theory aside, but we've seen it challenged by an employer theory that a secondary earner can be paid less. And we've seen that same secondary earner theory advanced by government officials and elected representatives as grounds for their recent arguments against any increases in the minimum wage and for the establishment of a kiddie wage somewhere below the minimum wage. Part of the response to that assumption that any worker is a secondary earner and that such a worker can be paid less is the campaign for pay equity. though pay equity as a wage theory has a validity quite of its own as well. Another part of that response is the growing membership and the increasingly active participation of women and minorities in our trade unions. The recession has put the employer in the position of advocating the inverse of our share of the profits theory in what are very tough times. So without getting the benefit of the share of the profits theory in good times, we've been forced to share the misery in bad times. I accept the biblical injunction that the laborer is worthy of his hire, but that won't work as a wage theory either. I recommend this subject for the consideration of the academics, but it will obviously also command the very practical attention of negotiators. I think that our unions abandon arguments for a larger share of the pie and for a greater share of the wealth created by our labor when inflation hit with such force beginning in the mid-'70s, with the result that they had all they could do to keep up with that inflation through cost of living clauses. When that wave subsided in the backwash of the Reagan recession, our negotiators worked their way through standstill or concessionary agreements and tried to deal as best they could with bonus arrangements, stock options, and with the overwhelming issue of employment security. With it all, the philosophic thrust of our efforts to redistribute wealth through collective bargaining was blunted and lost. If, or as, the nation emerges from that recession, I believe that our unions will revisit those arguments because we cannot forever accept wage theories based on maintaining whatever wage relationships or whatever wage versus profit relationships happen to exist. Tomorrow's union will renew its demands for a more equitable distribution of the wealth it helps to create in its collective bargaining role, and in its secondary legislative action role will seek a more equitable distribution of the nation's wealth through a revised tax system and other aspects of social policy. Tomorrow's union, absent massive growth in employment opportunity in the short run, will also emphasize employment security in its negotiations and job creation in its political and legislative actions. To the extent that government addresses the latter issue and, in concert with labor and business, puts in place a successful industrial and trade policy, then to that extent the emphasis on job security in individual negotiations may be eased. But the surest contribution that the trade union movement can make to job creation in this nation is to begin to address the overall question of a reduction in the now standard 40-hour work week. It has been more than 50 years since we've had any general movement in that standard, and 25 years since the 40-hour work week was established in the lowest paid service industries. It is going to be an impossible task, a subject difficult even to address in the current economic climate. But I submit to you that at the moment at which the economic climate begins to improve, at the moment at which there's a sense of increasing productivity and the possibility of using some of that productivity gain for wages or other purposes, tomorrow's union will address the use of some of that productivity increase and other increases in a campaign to reduce the standard hours of work in this country. America's union tomorrow will, as our report suggests, develop the techniques of the corporate campaign in ways thus far only imagined to bring non-workplace pressures to bear on recalcitrant employers. As pensions, once seen as a rather tenuous promise, move closer to being individual entitlements, the union will move to exert greater influence over the pension funds, their management, and their investment. We've read Peter Drucker of that institution down the road and are prepared to agree that we do indeed own a slice of America through our pension fund holdings, and it makes no sense for us to allow that portion which we own to be used to injure worker interests. America's unions tomorrow will be quite different in structure than today's unions, which rely so heavily on a single line of administration, authority, and participation, the shop steward line, as the essential link between leadership and membership. If we are going to be successful in increasing membership participation in our unions, it'll require a structure broad enough to accommodate the varied interests that groups of members will have in different parts of the union agenda. The inevitable expansion of quality of work life and workplace democracy issues will establish a whole separate line of communication and participation made up of those activists interested in QWL and worker participation issues. Parenthetically, it's appropriate to note that every major union that's experimented with quality of work-life participation issues reports that a totally different segment of its membership is interested in those issues than has been concerned with the traditional grievance and collective bargaining issues. If we are successful in implementing the programs designed to improve communications among members, another line is going to be created made up of the communicators who will conduct a one-on-one program, driving discussion of trade union issues and handling the flow of communications up and down the entire chain between leadership and membership. Other lines will surely be created, made up of trade unionists who are interested in our community service activities, and it's possible to imagine the development of dozens of other lines of membership participation and communication in an organization which then becomes much more vertical than horizontal. The report suggests a number of ways in which our unions need to be updated, their performance improved, and their acceptance in the community thereby heightened. The reality is that none of those things can happen quickly, but all of them must happen. The structure, function, effectiveness, and acceptability of our trade union movement is truly a kind of seamless garment, and improvement must occur in every area of our activity for the results to be seen clearly in any. I suppose it is that fact which makes it so very hard to begin, but I would submit that begin we have. The difficulty in attempting to speculate about America's unions tomorrow is our inability to predict the political course of this nation, the likelihood of change in our labor laws, or the likelihood of change and evolution in the attitudes and conduct of employers toward American unions. The persistence in a course of union avoidance, the National Association of Manufacturers adventures with a Committee for a Union-Free Environment, can only engender continuing conflict. While it may seem appropriate for academics and journalists to lecture the trade union movement on the need to abandon a confrontational approach and to deal more cooperatively, the very real problem which we confront is in finding employers, public or private, who wish to deal cooperatively with us. Some level of confrontation in our relationship is inevitable and should not be avoided. The interests of union and employer in the question of wage levels, job conditions, and the distribution of profits are quite different. And to assume that easy agreement is possible is to deny human nature. But that essential conflict, that confrontation between union and employer, ought to be limited to the period of negotiation and should be replaced for the much longer period of contract life by a spirit of cooperation. Unfortunately, it is only in a relative handful of organized workplaces that an enlightened management has accepted our desire to move from conflict to cooperation and has been willing to accept participation of the union as a real partner in the process. In the overwhelming majority, the employer resists any effort on the part of employees to organize, or at least resists any spreading of the union to currently unrepresented units, or continues to stimulate decertifications, or at a minimum, maintains as part of the normal training for all supervisors an elaborate and ambitious union avoidance program. The reality is that the employers of America, acting individually and through their organizations, have proclaimed their flat-footed opposition to any change in the nation's basic labor relations statute, which might make it responsive to the needs and desires of workers. And public employers struggle to prevent the passage of collective bargaining laws in their states, aided and abetted by politicians who seek office by running against government and its employees. Together, both public and private sector have proclaimed in a full chorus their determination to oppose the efforts of their workers to form and join unions. And then, without so much as a pause for breath, they proclaim their desire for labor management cooperation and express the need to join together to increase productivity as if it was simply a matter of worker effort. Strange behavior? I think it is. Counterproductive? Of course it is. Behavior for which they're criticized, ridiculed, or even questioned? Not at all. It is perfectly acceptable in America. It's good old American-style free enterprise capitalism at its best. That's the kind of thing we're told made America great. On this issue, the future is clearly in the hands of American employers and their organizations. If they persist, they will continue to drive the trade union movement into an increasingly oppositional posture, to the detriment not only of their relationships, but of the nation. The truth is that most of America's employers are far more supportive of Solidarność in Poland than they are of solidarity in America. And strangely enough, they see no conflict in those attitudes. In some future administration, as the government attempts to address the need for sensible industrial policies and trade policies, it will need to establish tripartite mechanisms of labor management and government. Tomorrow's unions will respond in the same spirit that enabled us to negotiate the National Accord of 1979. But if American management persists in its anti-union course, it will make agreement difficult and close cooperation impossible. The result could well be that at a future time when the nation needs to address the issues of growth, of trade, of employment and training, of investment, perhaps of national wage movements and inflation, it will be ill-equipped to do so. Similarly, in some future administration, the government will seek to update our labor laws, to make private sector labor relations productive, and perhaps even to make public sector labor relations sensible, under the goad of our unions and of a general public aroused by the denial of elementary rights to workers. At that point, a major revision of law will take place to guarantee and protect worker rights, to provide for some lessening of conflict, and perhaps to recognize the rights of workers to some form of tenure and to basic benefits beyond the minimum wage in the style of many of the industrial nations of Europe, and perhaps to enlarge and to vary the forms of representation. Interestingly, Executive Order 10988, creating the rights of representation and bargaining for federal employees, signed 24 years ago by the president after whom this great school is named, established different levels of bargaining rights dependent on the percentage of workers represented. And that, too, is a concept that might usefully be re-examined. On the international scene, America's unions tomorrow will, of necessity, enlarge their international contacts and activity and work in even closer concert with trade unions in other nations within similar industrial groupings. As the world markets become even more interwoven, the ties of philosophic solidarity which bind us will be strengthened by the pragmatic ties of coordinated negotiations and of confrontation and cooperation with the same and similar employers. Those who speak of the decline and or the death of the labor movement overlook the fact that it is not merely a collection of institutions, but it is a movement, an idea, a philosophy, a piece of society. It has existed and survived in one form or another ever since human beings first found themselves in the position of having to earn their daily bread by working for others. And it will exist as long as that arrangement continues. Unions have, in fact, no life of their own apart from their members. They are, in fact, their members. And they change in every generation in whatever way the needs of those members dictate. The changes now underway, as reflected in our report on the changing situation of workers and their unions, led Businessweek magazine to call our efforts Labor's bold pledge to come back swinging. Businessweek said in a subhead, the report, quote, could trigger Labor's greatest offensive in 20 years. That, I submit, is a prediction that today's unions intend to fulfill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Donahue, for that eloquent statement of the future of our unions. Now, I believe that we have some time for questions, for comments, and I believe Mr. Donahue would be glad to take those. I'm not sure there's any purpose, Tom, of my serving as an intermediary, and it seems to me much more sensible for you to recognize whoever you wish and go ahead and comment on it.
Glad may be an overstatement, but willing is all right. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Right then.
You want their name?
I would. Could I have some identification? It would be very helpful to me.
Yes. My name is Jeff Spector. I'm a mid-career MPA in Independence. You spoke of the failure of the National Labor Relations Act in your presentation, and I wonder if you would comment a little further on the Reagan National Labor Relations Board.
Sure.
And
How much time we got?
some of the ways that unions are, some of the possibilities that unions are exploring
Sure.
for dealing with the changes.
Okay. I spoke of the utter and abject failure of the law and the board. Here's a law with a preamble that says it is the policy of the government of the United States to encourage the practice and procedure of collective bargaining, which holds itself out as protecting the rights of workers and guaranteeing them an opportunity to form, join, or assist in the formation of unions, be represented in the process. Law fails absolutely because this is a law which, I tell you, in 1984, 1 of every 20 workers involved in an organizing campaign was fired for being in such a campaign. That is not a statistic based upon our analysis. That's what the National Labor Relations Board found. Numbers of people, or percentage of workers who were entitled to reinstatement because they had been fired for union activity. One could speculate that the number might be at least twice that by my definition. But the National Labor Relations Board, as bad as it is, found 5% of the people involved in campaigns fired for that activity. And the law, in its majesty, reinstated those people, or ordered those people reinstated to their jobs. Now, the reality is that took place 3 years later, but that kind of gets lost in the process. So you have a law which says we'll protect workers' interests, doesn't do it, says that if you're fired for joining a union, we'll make sure you're reinstated, does that 3 years later. There's just no reality to that kind of process. What we have said in the report, and what all of our unions are saying privately, is that we need to find other ways to do our business because of the utter and abject failure of the law to defend those rights. People can't wait 3 years to have a wrong redressed. What we've talked about is to examine, are there other ways to bring non-workplace pressures on employers which might be a little faster in their application and a little more responsive to the needs in the situation. The corporate campaign is a kind of a shorthand for a variety of activities that one can pursue to bring to bear those non-workplace pressures. In the simplest expression of that, it is to hold up to scorn in a community, or to hold up for examination in a community, the fact of an employer's conduct when that employer fires somebody for joining a union. Let the people know that. Let them make their judgment about that. to demonstrate to people in a community the anti-union animus, if you will, of an employer, and let them decide whether they want to keep on buying the product or whether that is a proper citizen of the community and somebody who should be well regarded in his role as a director of the bank or whatever. We think there is more benefit to the trade union movement and more opportunity for the assertion of workers' rights in those kind of processes than there is currently in the processes of the board. Everybody has simply thrown up their hands and been impatient with that. Now, there was a discussion at a meeting of the Executive Council in which we discussed quite seriously the question of a formal boycott of the National Labor Relations Board. And there was a judgment, I think quite proper, that that would not be appropriate, since that would leave a weapon in the hands of employers which we could not use. And so there was a decision that we would continue to use the board. And it has some marginal utility to trade unionists in terms of bringing on an election process. If you're lucky, if there's not too much argument about the unit, if in the best of circumstances, you can get an election in 3 to 6 months. And that works for some people in some unions. And so we've not taken the step of boycotting the board, but nobody really believes that that's the answer to the process. The examination of whether or not workplace pressures, non-workplace pressures can work, I think is terribly important for the nation. It's important for us, because if they work, that's fine. It's important for the nation because if they don't work, then there's nothing left but absolute confrontation. Then you face the necessity that when you organize to strike. It's the only way to go. You don't organize workers to vote. You don't convince them that there's a law that protects them and that they'll have an opportunity to freely express a choice. You organize them so they will strike. You organize them in the most militant fashion. And you bring about a condition in the nation which presents all sorts of turmoil and conflict, which is counterproductive. But that's where we are. We've lost the opportunity to use the rational processes of law. We're trying to invent something else in the middle, and if it doesn't work, the nation's in deep trouble. Peter?
Peter Norwich at Boston University. I want to take the opportunity to make a philosophical comment and give you the chance to make a philosophical reply. If you take the keynote looking back 100 years in the AFL-CIO, in a kind of crude way, the decision was made to opt for business unionism, which was in fact a decision to opt for minority unionism with a certain amount of economic leverage in the country, economic and political leverage, above and beyond the pure numbers. And that kind of philosophy has played itself out over 100 years, and you find yourself now confronted in a situation where in recent years you became more of a minority and lost some of your leverage. Now, has that brought about any interest in changing, in a sense, the philosophical organization of the union movement in this country, in your view, either with respect to the question of the balance between business unionism and political unionism, or in the shift between a kind of workplace orientation and a more centralized approach to the goals and ambitions of the union movement? And in your remarks, in a sense, you offered us everything. You said in the future we see a more responsive, a more high-tech, a more professional business union movement, and yet one which is also more aggressively political. But what I'd like you to do is comment on the changing balance, one way or the other.
I don't know if it's changing balance. I'm not 100 years old. But I will be prepared to come back and tell you. I would at the outset reject with all deference to a distinguished professor the business unionism label and substitute in its place a workplace unionism label, only because of the pejorative nature of the word business unionism. I know you did. Workplace unionism is really what America's unions have been about. And I think what you suggest is true, that there is a dual approach. We are and hope to improve our technical abilities to deal in workplace unionism, because that is the primary focus, and that is why people belong to American unions, and it is the strength, the past and the future, I believe, of America's unions. There is a change in the balance of that. Sam Gomper said we will elect our friends and defeat our enemies in a kind of a vague term. I think we've somewhat refined that in recent years and made it a bit more precise as to who our friends are, who our enemies are. No, I think there's a vast increase in our political activities, and I think there's an increase in the, as you correctly suggest, in the centralization of activities. I would offer you the president of a million-member union who argues in every council of the AFL-CIO that we need to defer to the Federation, and we need indeed to give back to the Federation some responsibilities for guidance, for coordination, or whatever. Jerry McEntee has been one of the strong supporters of that theory that we need in these times to take your pick, either huddle together or to centralize, either way you like it. But we need a more coordinated approach to the problems that we confront, both in the political and in the workplace roles. In the political role, I tried to suggest that there are people outside who make all sorts of analyses of what we do and all sorts of suggestions about what we ought to do or ought not to do, and there's very little concern or controversy about that within the movement. We have a very clear picture of the necessity of our being involved in the political process and the most efficacious way for us to be involved in that process. And it is through the most unified approach that we can make, and that is a unity within the Democratic Party and the endorsement of primary candidates and so forth, though I tried to suggest to you that the endorsement isn't necessarily an essential part of it. It is the unity that's the essential part of it. So I think, yes, there's a movement from what I wouldn't see, but others might see as business unionism or as workplace unionism, and a shift of emphasis to a more centralized structure. And I would suggest to you that exists not just in the political arena, it exists in the organizing arena. In terms of our efforts, the role of the Federation 10 years ago would have been described as, we're not into organizing, that's the responsibility of the affiliates. In a much more complicated world, we say, of course that's the role of the affiliates, but somebody has to coordinate that and work with the affiliates to centralize and direct it. So in a number of areas, there is a strengthening of a central structure. Yes, indeed. I find that a very useful move, and Jerry McEntee's nodding his head. Yes?
Brad Mitchell, I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy training school, and I was wondering what impact you think the multi-tier contracts have on the future of the labor movement.
I don't think they have any effect on the future of the movement. I think they have great effect on the future of the companies in which they exist. I mean by that I would not want to be the personnel director or the foreman of that company which has two wage rates for the same work in the same workplace. At least not where those two tiers don't ever come together. I think, you can rationalize a structure in which somebody comes in at an entry-level rate and works his or her way up. But you can't ever rationalize a workforce which is forever divided. You, because you came 10 years ago, will get to this level. Someone else who came this year will only get to a much lower level. That's impossible. And the seeds of its destruction are contained within itself. I really don't think that's a problem for our unions, so long as our unions never can be accused of complicity in establishing the process. Okay? Unions that I know that have accepted two-tier agreements have dealt with the reality that workers are not willing to strike over that issue, though I could point out several interesting and significant exceptions to that. But by and large, it's very hard to say to a group of workers, now we're going out on strike because this employer insists that people you never met before are going to be hired at a lower wage rate. By and large, one cannot expect current employees to do that. I'd offer you, though, the significant exceptions, the airlines in United, the airline pilots who said, no way, not going to do that. And one of them, the most, I suppose some would say, I would not be accused of, but some would say the most untypical of our unions, highest paid members we have, went out on strike and stayed out on strike. And the would-be pilots, the trainees who were being trained by United to scab, refused to do that. It's a classic and beautiful story of the solidarity of people. So I think that's the significant exception to it. But the short answer is I think that two-tier agreements contain within themselves the seeds of their own destruction, and they will self-destruct at some point. 3 years, 6 years down the road, those companies cannot live with those agreements. It's impossible. Yes, sir? I hesitate to answer a question which begins with a statement of the problem of the South, since my distinguished president, who is a South Carolinian, would be offended by that phrasing. The problems of those states in which we don't have substantial strength are